This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, your weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is February 23rd, and it's just me, producer Pat. The rest of the crew has got a couple of weeks off, but fear not, we still have a show for you today. Two segments. First, Cristina and I have a chat with Ryan Armstrong, who writes at Post-Truth Health and is also a volunteer for Bad Science Watch. And then Darren has a promised follow-up to his segment about what a neuron is, with how many neurons are in the brain. I hope you enjoyed the show.
Today, we're really stoked to have Ryan Armstrong on the show. Ryan Armstrong has a PhD in biomedical engineering and is an active volunteer with Bad Science Watch, a nonprofit activist organization dedicated to improving the lives of Canadians by countering bad science. Now, on his own blog, Post-Truth Health, great name, Ryan takes on charlatans who spread false medical information. Now, we recently met Ryan at Dr. Ken Doc Milne's home when Ken hosted a party for Dr. Jen Gunter. He's been keeping us up to speed on a few things he's been working on, and when he sent us a link to his recent blog post about prenatal sex determination tests, we knew we had to have him on to discuss not only the test's claims, but the reporting around it. Welcome to The Reality Check, Ryan.
Well, thanks for having me.
So before we jump into that, Ryan, can you tell us sort of, we've talked about Bad Science Watch many times on the show, and we've had guests on from Bad Science Watch, but it's been a little while since we had Jem on, I think, last time. Can you sort of tell us where things are at with Bad Science Watch and what you guys are working on?
Absolutely. So Bad Science Watch generally is looking at policymakers and regulators and trying to target that end of enforcement and regulation when it comes to consumer health issues, where science comes into play. And so in many cases, these involve medical products, natural health products. So our current project involves assessing the marketing and advertising claims of natural health products as regulated by Health Canada. And ultimately, the question we want to ask is, are these products being marketed and advertised in a way that is in line with what they're authorized to do through Health Canada, which permits them to make specific claims in regards to diagnostics as well as diseases. So we are just in the midst of our pilot study right now where we're examining cancer claims in the context of marketing of different health products and supplements, et cetera. And we're really just assessing whether these claims are in line with the authorization. We don't have the results quite yet. My personal experience is that in many cases, they are not in line with what they're authorized to claim.
Right. And is this something that Bad Science Watch is doing in isolation, or is this something that you're looking for the public to help with?
In terms of the public, we do have a large number of volunteers. It is an entirely volunteer-run organization. So that's kind of the contribution and involvement with the public. Once the results are out and we publish a press release, it's at that point where we'll be looking for the public to get involved, and hopefully we can rally Health Canada and different regulators to help get this type of advertising in check.
So that'll be a really great time to have you back on. So let's jump into this story, Ryan. It seems that there's kind of two parts to it, and the first part is this CBC article that sort of sets you down this path. Can you kind of give us a Cole's Notes of what that CBC article was?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came across the CBC article entitled "Kitchener Woman to Sell Home Test to Determine Sex of Fetus." In it is essentially promoting this product called Gender Sense, which is advertised as a urine-based prenatal sex determination test. So the idea is at around 10 weeks of pregnancy and beyond, you can buy this test for, I think it is intended to retail around $30, $40. Mix the test with urine, wait 5 minutes, and then based on the color that the test changes, it's an indicator of the sex of the fetus. The big issue I had in the publication by the CBC is that it mentioned an 80 to 92% accuracy of the test based on 3 studies. As far as I can tell, there are no studies publicly available. The studies are not referenced, and I can't find any evidence whatsoever indicating that there are different markers in urine, especially as early on as 10 weeks, that can be used with a cheap at-home mixture of chemicals to determine accurately the sex of a fetus.
So absolutely no fact checking on this one.
Very little fact checking. There's a separate article published in The Record, which I believe is a Kitchener-based publication, and they at least contextualize the claim, saying that the entrepreneur who is promoting and selling the product, or at least planning to sell the product, they say she says it's 80 to 92% accurate, whereas the CBC article goes full on with, and I quote, "The kit has an 80 to 92% accuracy rate based on 3 studies."
Wow.
And so do we imagine that if these 3 studies exist, they were done by the company and are closed?
Yeah, so that's the perception that I got. After some digging, I found a very similar product that is sold in the United States. This product has a similar name. So the Canadian-based product is going to be known as GenderSense, whereas the American product that seemed very similar was called IntelliGender. So both tests, as I said, very similar. They both claim to be effective within 10 weeks of pregnancy. They allege an accuracy between 80 to 90%. They both claim to have 3 studies supporting the product. And both tests claim to turn orange or yellow for a girl and green for a boy. And they both retail for about the same price. So it's not, I haven't been able to make a firm connection, but it's pretty clear that the products are at least similar. What was really concerning is that this product, IntelliGender, has had multiple lawsuits launched against it in the U.S., some successful, for not only misleading advertising regarding the efficacy of the product, but as well for explosions caused by the product. Nothing that's resulted in any chronic injuries, but apparently when mixing these specific chemicals, which appear to be very similar to what is effectively just Drano, when you mix them with urine in an uncontrolled environment, they can explode and potentially cause injury. Yeah.
So they probably don't work, and they're dangerous, or potentially dangerous.
So that was the case made by, I believe it was the state of California.
So in doing this research, did you dig into how we actually do determine sex?
Absolutely. So we don't do any testing that is specifically just for sex. We do a number of different tests where sex is a component of the genotype that may predispose a fetus to specific genetic anomalies. A lot of this testing is really just done if the mother or the father is at high risk for different genetic anomalies that may be present in the fetus. In the absence of high risk, usually the best indicator is just an ultrasound, which is, I think, around the 20-week mark.
Right.
If there's cause for concern, there are a couple other options that are somewhat invasive, either a chorionic villus sampling or a amniocentesis. Those can both be performed pretty early on within pregnancy, and they're pretty effective diagnostic techniques, but they come with a small risk of miscarriage. It is a very small risk, of course. There's an alternative technique which is becoming more popular lately, which is a blood test that samples cell-free DNA. So this is essentially DNA from the fetus that has been transported through various means into the mother's blood, and at I think it's around 10 weeks of pregnancy and beyond, can be somewhat accurately sampled to test for certain genetic anomalies.
So when we ask what's the harm, I guess if someone was high risk for something and was counting on one of these tests to determine the sex of the child, there's some sort of risk of harm there.
Yeah, so I mean there are medical issues and there are social issues.
Sure.
If we're talking about medical issues, there are definitely sex-linked genetic conditions. And of course, I'm sure it wouldn't affect a clinical decision because no obstetrician is going to rely on a parent's home test. Mm-hmm. But it could very much be a cause for concern, certainly among those taking the test. And when we're talking about, social issues, there's, people prepare psychologically, I think, for the sex of their child. It may impact their shopping, their religious practices. There are a number of complex social issues which may or may not be be valid. But still, these are things that people take very seriously in some cases.
Is it now available in Canada, or it's coming to Canada?
It's coming.
Okay.
As far as I can tell.
And so, what's Health Canada going to do about this?
Yeah, so great question. So Health Canada has actually gone on record and said that they're not going to regulate the product. The reason being is that they don't consider sex determination itself to be diagnostic, because it does not diagnose a condition. So while it may be a reasonable marker or risk factor for certain conditions, it in and of itself is not a condition. So Health Canada has said they won't be involved. So when we're talking about the accuracy of advertising, I think this product will largely fall under the purview of the Competition Bureau.
Yeah, that's really disappointing, but not surprising, because this isn't the first time that we've encountered this with Health Canada.
Yeah, it's pretty complex. Another issue I didn't bring up, which seems to be a quite contentious matter, so I won't take a position on the topic, but there seems to be fear that this type of information, especially very early on, we're talking first trimester, when abortion is very, very feasible. There's definitely concern that sex selection via selective abortion may be an issue, but I generally take the position that empowering consumers with good and reliable medical information is always a good thing. But I guess it's kind of a moot point if the product doesn't work. But if people are relying on the accuracy of it and making those types of decisions, and that could be a huge issue.
Yeah, definitely. There could be some ethical concerns there for sure.
Ryan, do these tests claim that they can give you results earlier than the 10 weeks? That's something that we have evidence to support, some method that has some evidence behind it. Do they say they actually work right away?
Not right away. Of course, a perfect test doesn't exist. A perfect test, if we had one, would be able to determine the sex at conception.
Right.
Obviously, such a thing doesn't exist. Looking at the article published in the Record here, they do contextualize how early the test is claimed to be effective. So it says it is self-administered test that reveals the sex of a developing fetus just 10 weeks after conception. And the very next line states, normally, ultrasounds cannot accurately see the sex of a fetus until after 20 weeks. Yeah, so they're absolutely making the claim within the context of other tests.
Now, one of your issues, you mentioned this in your blog post with this CBC article, when you're talking about discussion contextualizing the product medically, was the fact that instead of interviewing someone in the medical field, the focus of this piece was regarding the name of the test, correct? They interviewed a sociology professor instead?
Absolutely. So what the test does, or at least claims to do, is determine the prenatal sex of a fetus. The product itself, however, is called gender sense. So the controversy that the CBC took on was the conflation of the terms sex and gender. And rather than bringing on an obstetrician to qualify on the accuracy and reliability of the product, they brought on a sociology professor to talk about the issues in conflating the two and, misapplying a gender to a fetus that hasn't yet been born. So in my opinion, it kind of missed the larger point of, does a product work? Because having the sex gender discussion without the context of the product, even necessarily working, I just see that as, we've gone too deep in assuming that the product works.
Right.
Well, thanks very much for that overview, Ryan. Where can people find you?
You can check me out at my website, posttruthhealth.ca. I've also been pretty active on Twitter lately, tweeting up a storm. I think my handle is Ryan Armstrong. I have my name publicly available, Ryan Armstrong. You can probably find me in lots of places.
And Bad Science Watch is badsciencewatch.ca, correct?
Yes.
Well, we'll make sure to have links to everywhere people can find you in our show notes as well.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Ryan.
All right, great. Thanks so much for having me.
And as things move forward with Bad Science Watch, do keep us informed. Certainly, that's one way that we at TRC can help.
Yeah, and then maybe the next time we have you back, we can talk about chiropractors.
Yes.
Oh, that'd be great. I've got some exciting news coming there.
Awesome.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
How many neurons are in the human brain? On episode 485 of the show, I discussed the basics of neurons, but I had originally started with the question of how many neurons we have. And is that question to which I now return. First, how big is the human brain? Well, an adult human brain weighs about 1,300 to 1,400 grams, about 3 pounds. A newborn is less than a third of that, about the size of a chimp's. Cats have a brain about 30 grams, with rats about 2 grams. And elephants have about 6,000 grams of brain. All right, that might be interesting, but what about neurons? As you may have guessed, number of neurons only correlates with brain size. Wikipedia has a nice list of animals by number of neurons, so you can find a chimp which has about 6.2 billion neurons, and a cat with about 760 million, and a rat with about 18 million neurons. All right, Darren, but what about people? A Google search turns up the answer, 100 billion neurons.
That's a lot.
But of course you listen to the Reality Check because we do more than a Google search. We actually click on at least one of the links.
I use DuckDuckGo.
We also think, 100 billion. That's a nice round number. Suspiciously round, in fact. Further, we might ask, how did they determine the number? They don't count them up one by one, so what did they do? You only have about 2.5 billion seconds in your life. You can barely get through a fraction of a brain. Here I turn to a Guardian piece from several years ago that highlights the efforts of Susanna Herculano-Huzel and a Frontiers in Human Neuroscience paper she published in 2009. She states that 100 billion neurons number appears in many textbooks. Further, when she made an informal survey with senior neuroscientists in 2007, it showed that most believed that the number of cells in the human brain was indeed already known to be 100 billion neurons, outnumbered by about 10 times more glial cells. They supposedly help out the neurons. But none of the consulted scientists could cite an original reference for these numbers.
Wow.
Everyone just like, yeah, it's just, it's a thing. We all know.
Wow.
Further, quote, the reason for such lack of references is that indeed there was, to our knowledge, no actual direct estimate of the number of cells or of neurons in the entire human brain to be cited until 2009. It's like the neuroscience equivalent of we only use 10% of our brain.
Right. Wow.
Jeez.
Well, I know confirmation bias is a thing. It's hard for such a finding not to reinforce my worldview that you can't trust anything. So how many neurons are there and how do we know? Herculano-Huzel wanted to know, and after considering the issue, she embarked upon an unconventional idea. Her team took the brains of 4 adult men over the age of 50 and turned them into what she described as brain soup.
Ooh.
Quoting the Guardian piece, the method involves dissolving the cell membranes of cells within the brain and creating a homogeneous mixture of the whole lot. You then take a sample of the soup, count the number of cell nuclei belonging to neurons, as opposed to other cells in the brain such as glia, and then scale up to get the overall number. The great advantage of this method is that unlike counting the number of neurons in one part of the brain and then extrapolating from that, it gets over the problem that different brain regions may have more or less densely packed neurons.
Cool.
Interesting. So, what did they find? The Guardian then quotes Herculano-Huzel, which says, we found that on average the human brain has 86 billion neurons. And not one of the brains we looked at so far has 100 billion.
Well, that's still close.
Correct, Adam. It's not off by an order of magnitude,
Yeah.
but it is off by 10 to 15%.
Yeah.
Continuing the quotation, even though it may sound like a small difference, the 14 billion neurons amount to pretty much the number of neurons that a baboon brain has, or almost half the number of neurons in the gorilla brain. So that's a pretty large difference, actually. So there, Adam. Refuted by a quote.
Yeah.
To give you a sense of the complexity, the following is from a paper by Herculano-Huzel's team called Equal Numbers of Neuronal and Non-Neuronal Cells Make the Human Brain an Isometrically Scaled Up Primate Brain. Kind of giving away the idea there. Quoting but editing from the results. Half of the cells in the human brain, or 86.06 plus or minus 8.12 billion, are neurons, with a range of 78, we'll say, to 95 billion neurons. The fractional distribution of neurons in the human brain does not correspond to the fractional distribution of mass among brain structures. Although 82% of brain mass consists of cerebral cortex, which including subcortical white matter, and 42% consists of cerebral cortical gray matter alone, the 16.34 plus or minus 2.17 billion neurons found in this structure represent only 19% of all brain neurons. In contrast, the cerebellum, which represents only 10% of the total brain mass, contains 69.03 plus or minus 6.65 billion neurons, or 80% of all neurons in the human brain. Why did I give you all that? First, to highlight that numbers are pretty much never round if they describe real-world phenomena. Second, to highlight that there is a range, and there are error bars. No matter what supposed number you hear about how many neurons are in the brain, there's always going to be some error bar. Finally, if you don't specify precisely what you mean by the word brain, you may end up misunderstanding the issue. This is what I meant by the cerebellum versus something else. Be like, oh, well, the human neocortex has this versus that. Going back to that Wikipedia entry about how many neurons per animal, For human, it actually says 16 billion. Like, what? I thought the answer was 85. Well, there is this descriptor in that same entry. For average adult, the human cerebral cortex, with an average of 16 billion neurons, is slightly below expectations, while the human cerebellum has 69 billion neurons.
Jeez.
16 plus 69 gets you 85, similar to the 86 that was mentioned.
Yeah.
So this is where you just have to differentiate between the cortex and the cerebellum, which, to be fair, both of them make up the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, in conclusion, the answer is not 100 billion. It is 86 billion, but with a pretty wide range. This leads to further interesting questions about what makes the human brain so special, but that might be on a different show.
Is it the software or the hardware or both?
Well, it seems like it's not size, and it seems not quite like it's the number of neurons, because we're just a scaled-up normal primate brain.
Yeah.
People often thought, oh, no, the human brain's somehow special.
Yep.
Now, of course, there's maybe a quadrillion synaptic connections, but how are they counting that number?
This kind of reminds me of a book that Darren and I read, Accelerando by Charles Strauss, and they scanned animals based on the number of neurons they had. It's just a science fiction book. They started with lobsters, so there's like these AI lobsters, and then there was cats eventually. So the guy has like a pet, like cyborg cat, and then humans eventually.
That cat was really powerful, from what I recall.
Quite. But yeah, it's interesting to think of it like that. If you're thinking about scanning a human brain, that probably won't be the first thing scanned as far as like an uploaded consciousness, right?
Correct.
Well, there you have it. That's this week's show. On behalf of the crew, think better to act better. Peace out, cuboids. Stay classy, not smart-assy. We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.